Howdy everyone, I'm not even going to pretend like I'm any good at intros anymore. We're just going to get right into it. To the right or to the left of me, depending on whether or not I flip the footage of this video, here I have all the books that I read in this last year. And I'm going to be talking about every single one of them, the good ones, the bad ones, the ones that I found to be weird, the ones that I don't recommend, and the ones that I do recommend that you guys should check out. You can give me all of your thoughts, your opinions in the comment sections. I'm interested in hearing if you either disagree or whether you happen to agree with what I have to say. I do want to mention that I think in this last year, this has definitely been the most amount of books I've read consecutively, like at least to be able to keep up with and complete. And I've realized that a big factor into that was that, you know, in the years prior, I was only ever reading books about writing or self-help. The original reason why I was getting into all of them was because I wanted to improve on my writing, and only ever consuming either of those things makes you kind of really hate reading. I'll get a little bit into it for my explanation on, you know, self-help and the problems that I have with the genre and its entirety, because I think on this pile I have two that I bought that I'm not entirely happy with the, you know, the results of how it was after finishing reading those. But in terms of just, you know, seeking out books that are there to improve your writing, I feel like it's just more effective to read a lot of fiction. I think reading fiction's fun. I think the general conclusion that I've come to is that if I ever want to read more and just expose myself to more things that I enjoy, just look for books that are good, that are written by good authors, instead of people that are lecturing you about specific ways that you need to like live your life or how to write better. But anyways, this is going to be a fairly long one. I really hope I can get this done all in one day, but we're going to see what happens. I'm going to talk about the first book, which is both Dune and Dune Messiah. So since around, I think, 2020 or whenever the first Dune movie came out, I have always been wanting to read the Dune series. I was one of those guys that, you know, watched the movie and always told themselves, like, I'm going to read the books one day. I'm going to do it. I'm going to totally do it. And I did. I got this from Barnes & Noble, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. But the furthest I ever got to was through book 1, which is about, like, a third of it. And then things in life came up and I just never got around to finishing it. So this year was my first time at ever giving it an honest to go. And I loved it. I absolutely loved reading it. If you're one of those people that were like me too, that really enjoy the movies and have always wanted to get around to seeing what happens in the books or what's different about it or what happens after the movies, because I think right now they're adapting Messiah, but I don't think they're going to continue afterwards. Dune in the movies is a very cinematic experience. Part of it is that, you know, the atmosphere and the world is like a character throughout the series, which is the same case in this book. I would argue that, you know, a big popular thing when people talk about world building is that they point towards Dune and talk about how it is one of the few cases where, you know, world building plays a significant role when it comes to the plot of the story. And that's always been like the selling point as to why people should read Dune. It's like, if you want to learn about world building, you should read Dune. But what I think I'm surprised coming out of it was that maybe it did play a big role as to what happens in the series, but that wasn't really what sold me on wanting to keep reading it. For me, what I loved about reading this was just the fact that it was basically intergalactic succession, in the sense that they have these really small, insignificant conversations revolving around the politics with the Atreides family and also the Harkonnen. And what I love is the fact that there are many small interactions that have pages and pages that are dedicated to what exactly is going on and how they're perceiving each other's body language. Because in the plot, Paul Atreides and his mother Jessica, they come from a background of Bene Gesserit training, which has made them really proficient in understanding body language. So when they're saying things like, oh, I agree with you, or I think this is a good idea, they're also, you know, analyzing their eyebrow movement or their facial expressions or seeing if their heart rate has increased by any chance. And I was noticing that while I was reading this book, I was going back into my everyday life doing the same thing. I'm like, oh, he said something, but he nodded his eyebrow. He's telling a half-truth. I was so into that. I really, really loved the fact that, you know, it mostly just consisted of dialogue and politics going on. There wasn't much action happening throughout the series, but I just thought it was so fun. In the same way that I love Succession, you know, it's like really small, insignificant conversations, but in the big picture, every sentence they're saying is like a really big role as to what could happen. I thought that was really fascinating. I absolutely loved reading this, and I ended up enjoying reading this so much to a point where I got both Messiah and then Children of Dune. Here I have Children of Dune as well on the bookshelf. Haven't read it yet because I'll explain what happened when I tried to read Dune Messiah. So for anybody that's watching this and has only ever seen the plots for the movies, I highly recommend you skip this part because there are going to be a few spoilers. I won't go too into detail about who dies, which characters do you care about that aren't going to fucking make it to the end. But to basically catch people up, if you happen to not care or if you've already read the series, the jump between this book to this is like a 12-year time skip. And immediately my initial impression was that I kind of wish that wasn't the case. I really liked where this book left off, and I kind of wish the sequel started from that point as opposed to skipping a whole bunch of stuff that I think I would have found quite interesting. Once again, I've only read these 2 books, so maybe they revisit back, but I highly doubt that, but you can let me know in the comments if that ends up being the case. But so anyways, a lot of things change by the time that we reach Messiah. Paul Atreides is a lot older. There are a lot of people that are dead now, and either that or they just happen to like not be a significant character in the main screen. And somebody that I missed a lot was seeing Paul Atreides' mother, Jessica, playing a significant role. She kind of just like disappears in this book. Yeah, so in substitute for Lady Jessica, she kind of gets swapped out for Paul's sister, Aaliyah, who is supposed to serve a similar role as like taking the side of the Ben Gesserit, but I just don't think I enjoyed her presence as much as I preferred what I saw in the first book. But that's all to say that like there are really great moments in this. It still is Dune and feels like Dune. I would say that there are definitely really specific moments that happen with Connie and Paul that I really enjoy, just the whole dynamic of having to do a battle between deciding what they want to do interpersonally versus like because they're political figures and they have massive amounts of power over the whole galaxy that they control over, they have to decide like what is good for the world versus what are the things that you and I want to do within ourselves. And I really like that. I think the other concept that I found to be really fascinating, both in this book and in the other one, was the way that the Fremen thought throughout the series. I think it's kind of noticeable in the movies if you happen to have seen the sequel or the second Dune film. But what I think is really cool about the Fremen is the fact that they think so collectively because they come from a planet that only has sand and spice and is like empty and it's a desert. Nourishment is the highest prized value to them. So for example, when somebody dies or passes away, what they do is they take the body immediately, drain it from all of its liquid so that it can be used for the rest of the whole collective Fremen community. And I think that's really cool. And then there's a scene, I don't remember if this happens in the movie, but I do know that it happens in this book, is that Paul, like I think, starts to cry over the death of somebody, and the Fremen gets super offended. They're like, how dare you waste moisture in front of us over something that's insignificant in like the big picture. I thought that as a concept was really fascinating, and they do explore some of that in Dune Messiah. So I did really appreciate that. But once again, I think mostly I just felt a little bit disappointed in the fact that what I loved in the first book, which was the world building, which was the, interplay between dialogue, and more so just kind of feels like things are happening. And it's a shorter story, so, it was less of a time investment. I was still able to like skim through it within the span of like a week. It didn't feel like a drag, but I more so just felt kind of like, nah, okay, that was cool. And then it kind of just ends, and spoiler warning, skip here if you don't want to know what happens at the end of Dune Messiah. But essentially, Aaliyah falls in love with like a robotic mechanic version of fucking, what's his face called? Well, of Duncan, Idaho. And I'm just supposed to buy that, I guess. Cool. Sick. I don't know. Granted, I've heard good things about the sequel of this one, which is this one, Children of Dune. I've heard good things about it, but I felt a little bit disappointed, and so I decided to slow it down afterwards and maybe possibly revisit this one later. Maybe you guys can let me know. But for now, I really, really, really loved the time that I had with both of these, but I just kind of was like, maybe this wasn't exactly what I expected to happen. So I don't know. We'll see. The only question that I have is like, how the fuck are they going to adapt this? Because this book, it's weird. There is some weird shit going on in this one. Okay, so the next book I want to talk about is the autobiography that was written by Werner Herzog. Funny thing about this is that I got the hardcover version off of Amazon, but I took off the cover. And the reason why I took off the cover is because I will show you what it actually looks like. And something about that sitting on my bookshelf was just not a thing that I wanted to do. It just did not look good being there. And also when people would come into my room and they'd be like, what the fuck is going on with that? It kind of just made me seem like a serial killer. So I was like, we're just going to stick to this. But yeah, in the year of 2024, I found myself, first of all, discovering who Werner Herzog is, and number two, becoming obsessed with pretty much everything that's related to him. So far, I would say he has made two of my favorite documentaries ever. The first one has to do with the bears in Alaska and the guy that was fucking following them around, vlogging until eventually him and his girlfriend got eaten alive by one of the bears that they were recording for like several days ahead of time. The second one is the one that takes place in Antarctica. In fun fact, that one is actually where I got the footage for the penguin in my video of the comic books with the prettiest art video. So I basically just ran into a bunch of clips on YouTube of Werner Herzog talking about like what his creative philosophies were, and I just became absolutely obsessed with the guy. Number one, because he was so strange. Like there's a clip where he talks about how he practiced hypnosis on chickens.
The enormity of their flat brain, the enormity of their stupidity is just overwhelming. Try to look a chicken in the eye with great intensity, and the intensity of stupidity that is looking back at you is just amazing.
There's also been a bunch of stories about how he was working with this guy who was like a clinically diagnosed schizophrenic, but he was a brilliant actor. And I think he did 5 movies with him in total that ended up being complete masterpieces. And on one of the sets, when they were filming in Argentina, the actor whose name I'm blanking on, he literally pulled out a gun and tried to kill a bunch of people on set, including Werner himself. And thankfully he missed a bunch because he was like blindly shooting it at a tent. But yeah, he continued to do, I believe, 2 to 3 movies after that whole thing happened. And so I was just fascinated with that whole, what type of personality would it take for a man to ever behave this way? And so good to know he had recently come out with an autobiography that I decided to read. And I would say after finishing this one, I am satisfied with the product that I purchased for. The only thing is that sometimes reading this book feels like you're hearing the tales of someone who is clearly 9 trillion years old, and you kind of just are like, can we get to the point? I kind of softly wish that somebody ghost wrote this book, because Werner Herzog collectively might just be one of the most interesting human beings on the planet. This guy has like infinite stories to tell in this book that like are genuinely fascinating. The problem is that like he just doesn't care to tell these stories. Like he's not trying to impress you as he tells them. And so sometimes he'll just go off into tangents that he feels like are important. And so you'll be hearing this profound story about how he was staying in the Amazonian jungle and surviving with these fucking 12-year-old kids that were foot soldiers in the country, and they, you know, were armed. And then in the middle, like not like, you know how paragraphs have an indent to break down the structure of like each topic that they're talking about. In the same exact paragraph, he'll just be like, yeah, so my grandparents met in Munich in 18 whatever the fuck, and you're like, why? I'm just like, can I hear the cool stuff, please, Werner? There was actually one single quote that I will not ever let down, and it's in this one bit where he talks about how he was a bit of a shoplifter when he was young, and that was because he made this friend who was like a chronic shoplifter, would steal like a shit ton because, you know, he came from like an unfortunate background and was just like doing a bunch of things that were getting him in trouble. And the way he describes this friend that he had in his childhood was that he had considerable criminal energies. I have not stopped thinking about that phrase for so long, because this guy had so much of his criminal energy that it needed to be considered. That who talks like that? This motherfucker over here wants attention and will not stop barking. So I guess you'll be hearing a review from the both of us now. Okay. The next series that I want to talk about. Yeah, so the next series that I want to talk about are basically, it was originally just going to be Slaughterhouse 5 that I read, but I ended up becoming so obsessed with reading the works of Vonnegut that I ended up reading 3 of a series in total, which were also Cradle, The Sirens of Titan, And then recently I also read Welcome to the Monkey House. So this whole section, we're just going to call it Kurt Vonnegut. Yeah, so in the last video where I talked about all the games that I played, there was a section where I mentioned that where I was really into consuming a bunch of time travel media. And at one point I got recommended to me to check out Slaughterhouse 5. I've heard this get mentioned before in a couple of video essays that I watched from Jacob Geller. And because of that, I think there was enough of like a selling point for me to want to check it out. And I absolutely, legitimately feel like this might be one of my favorite books that I've ever read. For some context on what exactly is Slaughterhouse 5 and why people refer to it when it comes to time travel media, basically what happens is that there is a guy who gets abducted by a species of aliens that's called the Tralfalmadorians. And the Tralfalmadorians don't see time as like a chronological thing. So the way we view things is there's a present, there's a past, and there's a future. And we're constantly coexisting within that present like it's a river that's flowing through like what we call time. The way Tralfalmadorians work is that they see all of time at once. So like if there was a beginning and there was an end, to them it's just like one big giant image that they can see all the time. And so when he gets abducted by this species of aliens, they are basically helping the main character, the protagonist. They're teaching him how to use those powers and be able to see all of time at once. But it's not really the plot itself that became the reason why I was so obsessed with it. I absolutely love Kurt Vonnegut's writing style. His prose is so funny because he'll just like double, triple, quadruple commit to every single bit. Like, for example, there's this section where he talks about how the main character, who, again, I'm blanking out on like every single name of every single character that I read in any of these books, but the protagonist meets a guy early in his days of the military and is way too into his role that he plays in the middle of this war that they're in. And so he like overpacks for their first mission. And at first it's like he brings a scarf and a butterfly knife and a backpack and a hat and a pair of shoes and a pair of backup shoes. And this is literally just an entire page of all the things that he packed. And for whatever reason, maybe it's just my type of humor, but I found it gradually more and more funny. At first you're like, okay, that's kind of funny. It's like, oh no, he's fully going to commit to this bit until like we're uncomfortable with it. And I love that. He would do that over and over again, which I just thought was so funny. And the other thing that I absolutely love with the prose was just the fact that it had really, really, really dark themes to express about war. Granted, a lot of it is because Kurt Vonnegut himself is kind of writing this as if it were a biography of his experience. He got drafted, I believe, for the Vietnam War and has shared in a bunch of interviews that, you know, he had to deal with PTSD and a bunch of chronic depression that came out of it. And so a lot of his media revolves around themes that are like anti-war based. And what's so fascinating is the fact that like he's able to do this balance between these really dark themes about the horrors of what it's like when people commit human violence on one another, while also just making it into like one big giant satire where you're just, you know, laughing your ass off, but also thinking to yourself like, this is some really fucked up shit that I'm looking at right here. Seeing somebody have the ability to do that in their writing is something I really, really, really respect. I was never really under the impression that I could read media and genuinely find it to be some of the funniest lines that I've read in the last year, but Kurt Vonnegut like 100% managed to prove me wrong, which then led me to just wanting to read all of his other stuff because, you know, so I revisited Barnes & Noble and I decided to read The Sirens of Titan and Cat's Cradle. This one is about a journalist that's trying to work on a biography on a like fake parody version of Oppenheimer. And this doesn't necessarily take place in a war. It more so has to do with like an insecure billionaire that's put on a mission of trying to save humanity by following the path of like a predetermined fate, and a big section of it is a war, quote unquote. I can't really describe much else unless you guys decide to check it out yourselves, but I loved it. I literally read all these three in the span of like 3 days. Like, I don't know what happened to me, but some chemical within me got triggered that I'm just like, I have not found something that I loved and adored this much in such a long time. I would even go as far as to say that what Kurt Vonnegut is for me with books is what Tatsuki Fujimoto is to me with manga. Just in the way that like they feel so unapologetically themselves, you know, when they're making things. They don't care to, you know, double, triple, quadruple down on every single joke that they're saying, but they also just don't care. Like, they don't care about the pressure of what people are going to think about the media that they make. They just kind of make things and it's loose and it's fun, but it also is is extremely expressive, and there are things that you can extract from it and think about it for years on end. Again, I haven't found something like that in such a long time. And so for anybody that, out of everything that I'm about to list in this video, if you have not read the works of Kurt Vonnegut, I 100% recommend it. These are basically all of his short stories. It's a collection of all the stuff that he basically admits to having made because he needed the finances to be able to fund himself as a writer when he was like up and coming. And so reading this, whoops, that scared the shit out of us. And so out of all of the works that I read, I wouldn't say that this was really remotely my favorite. Like, it honestly, there were a lot of stories that were kind of met in here, but I found it to be the most inspiring just because I thought it was interesting to see what a guy in his early 20s was trying to work on that would eventually shape a lot of the ideas and works that he would express in the later on works. Yeah, once again, big fan of Kurt Vonnegut. I almost wish that there were more things to check out. I know he has a couple more books, but I want to pace myself out very easily. But I'm very happy and satisfied with the fact that I managed to find my a new favorite author / person that I really, really, really admired. Anyways, so in theme of a bunch of time travel stuff, my sister at some point heard that I was in search of that type of media, and so she gave me this book, which was written by Stephen Hawking, which is essentially exactly what it's called. It's a brief history of time. I believe this came out in like the early 2000s / in the 90s. It basically is the entire timeline of how humanity has discovered time and the relationship that they have with it, dating all the way back to Galileo to how we perceive it now. I would say this was a bit more of a drag to get through, mainly just because you almost like have to take annotations to be able to fully understand what exactly it, like, some of the concepts are that he's been trying to talk about. And I think about halfway through, I just needed to accept the fact that I don't have a PhD in physics, so I won't be able to fully grasp the things that are being discussed in this passages unless I were to reread it or I were to have like a mentor explain some of the concepts to me. But there were a lot of things that I thought were, elementary enough for me to, find genuinely fascinating. I could almost see how, this was a New York Times bestseller back in the 90s or early 2000s. And I could understand how this probably was the inspiration for like a lot of popular sci-fi media that came down the line. Like, I'm almost suspicious of the fact that I'm sure Christopher Nolan probably read this at some point before having worked on like a lot of his main series. So for example, Stephen Hawking at some point makes an analogy of how if an astronaut were to gradually approach towards a black hole nearing towards its event horizon, and he were to have like a timer on his watch that beeped every second, building up to 12 o'clock at noon, as this astronaut would gradually get closer to the black hole, the ticks between each second would go slower and slower and slower, and then it would just never actually be able to reach noon. It would be like 11:59, 59, 59, 59, and they would just like never get feedback from that astronaut. Granted, also the astronaut would probably die and get warped and strung out like a spaghetti strand, but I thought that was like a really cool, way to explain the effects that a black hole has, especially on time and also just like how we perceive light going into it. The other analogy that I thought was cool, maybe you guys can tell me if I'm the only one that didn't really understand what a fucking light year meant, but I'll say what he explains in the book and then you can let me know if I'm like a dumb person or not. What Stephen Hawking mentions about what it's like to observe things in space is that when you see planets that are 5 fucking trillion, bazillion, gazillion miles away, the problem is that we're only perceiving information of what they were like millions of years ago because it's only being updated and being traveled at X amount of light years that are away from us. And so we can only guess that maybe they're still there or maybe they're not. And so when I read this, I was like, oh my God, that's so fascinating. And then I said this to like a friend of mine and she was like, yeah, no duh. And I was like, my bad. I thought that was cool. I thought that was a cool thing. Anyways, you can let me know. I thought that was a cool thing. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is Moby Dick. I feel like I've made so many references to this fucking book throughout my videos that I finally just decided to suck it up and be the guy who was gonna know what actually entails in the book of Moby Dick. And then I tried reading it, and I would say that this section of the video is gonna be less of a review and more so like a cry for help, because I think I simply just don't know how to read this. prior to opening this, I thought I was a pretty competent person. I thought I could read books and be able to comprehend most of the things that they're saying at a pretty like high level. And then I read Moby Dick and I was like, oh, I don't know fucking anything about anything. And, you know, even the foreword that was written by the publishers for this series gives like multiple warnings like, hey man, if you intend to read this, it's going to be like a tough go. Like you're going to have to roll up your sleeves and, you know, really, really prep yourself for what you're about to get yourself into. And so I was reading this kind of cocky, kind of confident. I was like, get the fuck out of here. It can't be that bad. And I also remember this detail of like in the forward, the publishers were like, Herman Melville doesn't simply just use an adjective. He lets it dance. He lets it simmer for a bit. And I was like, what the fuck are these guys going on about? And so then I roll up and whip out the fucking chapter 1 of what happens in Moby Dick. And I'm like, I cannot physically read this thing. And so as my cry for help, I would like to ask if anybody watching this has happened to have read either like very difficult, older, more purple prose type of literature, or has actually read Moby Dick. Please let me know, how am I supposed to read this? Because I don't know if I'm supposed to either. So these are like the two approaches I tried while looking through that first chapter. Was number one is I would carefully analyze every single word that was in each passage, and I would try to form an idea out of that to really find the meaning behind what's going on. That failed. I couldn't understand anything. I needed to do so many fucking, you know, backs and constant like annotations back and forth to understand what a queequeech is. And so the second approach that I had was that I instead tried to skim through the whole paragraph and try to collect like an idea of what that paragraph was about. That also failed. And so now I just kind of have my dick in my hand and I don't exactly know what to do. So please let me know what I'm supposed to do, because I do want to read this. Like I did some research. I looked up what other people's thoughts were on it. They all have kind of said the same thing, that like Moby Dick is it's quite a lot to like, you know, be able to get through. But I do want to push. I want to climb this mountain. I want to be able to climb this mountain, and I just need some help. I need some help. Let me know. Anyways, next book. Okay, so this section is now going to be the bit where I give a little bit of a rant about the self-help phase that I was going through for quite some time, right up until about last January/February, where I started to read two books. Number one was The Inner Game of Tennis, and number two was a book called Never Split the Difference. So I'll first talk about them, and then I'll give my whole spiel of the problem that I've realized about the whole genre. So right after New Year's passed by, I picked up this book called The Inner Game of Tennis, and it's kind of been recommended, I believe, in like the Melee/Tekken scene. I don't remember where I heard that from, but basically like a lot of online pro players have recommended this. You know, it's like a short book that just, you know, is like, it serves as a guide on the proper way to learn how to learn, essentially. Like, what's the most productive way you can improve at a skill? And in that sense, I would say this is a great book. It's a good book because basically the author was a tennis coach, I believe, in the 50s and 60s, and he ended up training like a lot of high level people, and is basically just teaching people how to learn and use these skills in like other ways. So if I were to give a summary, and if you didn't ever want to read this book, essentially the message behind what the guy is trying to say is that if you're trying to hit a tennis ball and you're a beginner, try not to think about the 90 things you're doing incorrectly, and try to just think about the one thing that you did right. And so, you know, if your coach says, hey, you had really good form on the rotation of your shoulders, you're like, okay, noted. And then +1 with that. Try to do that, and then add another thing that you want to focus on, and just like 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, instead of trying to be this ginormous, massive critic to yourself whenever you're trying to improve. So in that light, I would say it's fine. Like it's a fine book that like you can read, and I'm sure this could possibly help somebody out there. It's really short, so like it's not even problematic. The only issue is that I just kind of felt like it was a bit repetitive towards the end, where I was thinking to myself, maybe this is because I come from a sports background, so a lot of the passages felt a bit obvious to me. But the other thing is that like I feel like the guy wants to write a biography and also write a self-help book, and this will eventually become a recurring problem when I talk about the next series, which is Never Split the Difference. But before I get there, I just want to say that, like, to the credit of this author, there is like an ending passage about how he talks about, you know, it's actually not about the importance of actually getting good at a skill. Sometimes people obsess over improvement and trying to be as productive as possible with the things that they learn. And he has like these last 2 pages that just talks about the importance of how, you know, you should prioritize other things at the end of the day. Like, I think he was pretty old by the time that he wrote this book, and he was like, I wish I was more present. I wish I was more, you know, I enjoyed things with my family more often. And if I can look back on my days of tennis, I wish I was just like more kind and more friendly and more open to just meeting more people, as opposed to constantly obsessing and fixating on having the perfect serve. And I thought that was really beautiful. So, you know, this one, out of, you know, granted the rant that I'm about to get into, I actually had like a fairly positive impression with this one. However, I cannot say the same for fucking Never Split the Difference. So, in the self-help world, this is one of the most popular series you will ever come across. And the reason is because the whole sales pitch as to why you should read this is because it is an FBI negotiator giving advice on negotiations, like general input on what you can do to improve your everyday life. Because at the end of the day, we negotiate with everything. We negotiate when we buy things, we negotiate with our family, we negotiate in our relationships. And so this is supposed to be the book that can really, really help you improve that. And as a sales pitch, that sounds like a really great idea. However, the problem is that the issue that I had in the last book about how some self-help books tend to really struggle on whether or not they want to be either an autobiography or a book that's meant to give advice to people, this is like the definition of that problem. I really, really hated the first 50 pages of this book because it's essentially Chris Voss talking about how fucking insanely talented he was when entering like this Harvard negotiation tournament. Basically, the way it goes is that he was, I think, in his early 20s, and at some point he decided to sign up at this Harvard negotiation / like speech and debate tournament that was going on over there. So he joins it, and then he literally just goes on to just suck his own dick and be like, I annihilated my enemy at this tournament, and just keeps like making fun of what these freshman Harvard students, what their tactics were when talking about negotiating. And it's just like, dude, who cares? If you've ever been to college, you would know that all of these tournaments are just silly, fun things that like a fucking, you know, obviously this is at a different standard from what an FBI negotiator or like a working person is supposed to be able to utilize. The tournaments are just kind of like, it's just a fun way to like network and connect with people and be like, hey, we have similar interests. Want to like go grab coffee after the thing is over? But he just takes it so, it's like this for fun event. And then there's just one guy who, number one, doesn't even go to the school. And number two, is just taking it so incredibly seriously. And then is writing it in his book to be like, I annihilated my enemy. This isn't even like the part where it gets bad. I don't even think, I just kind of got a bit of a bad zhuzh after reading those first pages where I'm like, what the fuck is this guy's deal? But this continues on for like the rest of the chapters where I personally think it really struggles to make a connection between the things and the scenarios that he had been as an FBI investigator versus actually trying to see how that could benefit somebody who's trying to buy a house or who's trying to like compensate in a relationship with like a significant other. For example, he tells this story about how he was over the phone with this like Filipino warlord, and the Filipino warlord was like, I'm going to chop this entire family's head off. And he's like, so this is what you gotta do. You gotta calm him down first, and then you gotta find the middle point, and then it's simple. And then he didn't end up chopping off their heads, and you're like, okay, sick, awesome. What the fuck am I supposed to do with that? And I've seen, the thing is that like, I've also seen him go on podcasts and give similar advice. So I think, for example, there was one that I listened to where he talks about how like if you have a flight that's delayed or if you have a really long layover, he like tells this story about how he went to the front desk and went up to the lady and was like, see, in these scenarios, it's simple. You got to be like, you having a tough day? And then the lady over the desk is going to be like, yeah, I am having a tough day.
When was the last time you looked at him and said, you know, you look like it's been a tough day, or you look happy, or you look distracted, or it looks like an average day? Like if they're stressed, walk up and they'll go, how are you today? because you're trying to push them into another mood.
And then you're like, well, could you help me out? And they're like, yeah, I could help you out. And everything from then on is simple. And so let me save you guys time. If you happen to be somebody that would like to get somewhat better at negotiating. Here's like the entire point of what this guy is trying to say, that he decides to expand it out over like 300 pages of a nothing burger. The key to negotiating is that it's not a competition. It's not you trying to one up the other person or having an ego battle. It is two people trying to meet at the middle and agree somewhere and try to see the other person's side and be like, hey, I see that you have this problem and you notice that I have this problem. Let's meet in the middle and come to an answer for the both of us. That could benefit the both of us. That will improve your negotiating because you will instead just stop perceiving it as like a big ego thing. So like master negotiators aren't dickheads. They're just people that have a lot more empathy. That as a theme is a good thing. That's a good thing. That's like a good message that you should try to say. However, I just do not understand what the fuck was the point of reading this book to be able to get a message like that. Number one, I have been one of those people that have had like a 10-hour layover, and I have gone to those people at the front desk. And for any of you that have ever done that before, literally you just go up to the lady, you say, hey, I have a 10-hour layover. Is there anything else open? And they're like, yeah, sure. I'll go check my fucking computer, and the computer will decide that answer for you. Can you imagine unironically going up to somebody and being like, hey, have you had a tough date? Like, what the fuck? Why would that benefit you in any circumstance? I don't understand who is supposed to, like, who is this advice for? This is like a made-up scenario that just sounds good on a podcast. So, no, I did not like this book. And it also led me to realize that I just don't like the self-help genre. I think I'm sick and tired of reading books where it's like half of it is, somewhat not even half. I would say 20% of it is genuine beneficial advice. But the problem is you have to read the other 80% where it's a person with a PhD or with like a high successful career just sucking their own dick, just globbering all over their own cum for no reason. And you just have to read that. You have to pay money and read that. I sound more upset than I really am. At the end of the day, I don't care. It was just a book that I bought. But for anyone who, might have fallen for the same trap where you seek out these books in hopes of it benefiting your life, it's not that they don't. I think they do. I really think that self-help, a lot of the top self-help books like Atomic Habits or, whatever, the 4-Hour Work Week or the 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, I'm sure all of those things can benefit somebody out there. But the problem is that a lot of these people are usually just successful businessmen that at the end of the day, part of their product and part of their revenue are from these books, which isn't inherently a bad thing. I don't think it's wrong for any of these authors to be incredibly rich and wealthy off of the books that they're selling, because at the end of the day, there are people out there who perceive that there is value in that. But I would just advise you to be aware of that. Be aware of the fact that you are essentially purchasing a product and it's promising you something, and sometimes / most of the time, I would say it's just gonna let you down. So yeah, that was the end of my self-help. I was like, I'm done with this. I decided to only start reading fiction after that, and that was one of the best decisions ever, mainly just because I found myself reading so much more. Number one, my only goal was to really get better at writing and read a lot more books, and I realized, oh, you can just read stuff that's fun. You don't have to fucking slog through and be miserable about everything. Okay, the next book I'm going to talk about is the biography of Leonardo da Vinci that was written by Walter Isaacson, who has made a bunch of other biographies of, very great, famous, successful people like Einstein, Steve Jobs. I'm pretty sure he did one of Thomas Edison, and then my dad has actually read the one that was on Elon Musk. And I have so many thoughts about this book that I'm not even sure if I could fit it into this video, so I will try my best to get everything out. If not, there's an entire possibility that I might just make like a separate video on the second channel. Okay, so for some context, I think around 2 years ago, I found myself becoming absolutely obsessed with Da Vinci, mainly because I was doing a bunch of research on painters and painting techniques, because I did a bit on Blue Period in my Great, Strange, and Terrible manga video, and that kind of led me down like a rabbit hole of finding a bunch of fun facts about painters, and Da Vinci was like the go-to guy. If you ever want to hear fun facts about whatever fucking historical figure, Da Vinci will always come up. And so like he always gets quoted as being like, the guy only gets remembered as being a painter painter, but in reality, he was many things. He was an engineer, he was a scientist, he did all of these things. And I mentioned that in my video because what I had done at the time was very surface level research on the guy. And so after having read this, I have now realized that there's like an iceberg of how people perceive Leonardo da Vinci. So at the top, da Vinci is known as the guy who is the turtle or is the guy who made the Mona Lisa. At the second level, he's known which is what I thought at the time, which is that he's not just a painter. He's actually a scientist, he's an engineer, and that he was actually a genius. And so then I got to reading this book. I thought it was really interesting. I think this is a great book. I would want to say, I would want to give the preface that Walter Isaacson is a great writer. It's kind of hard to make judgments about a biography, specifically when it's about the person themselves, because you're essentially making judgments about the lifespan of someone who, number one, isn't aware that you're reading a book about them because they passed away and they're also from many hundreds of years ago. Having said all of those disclaimers, though, it did get a little bit frustrating to read more and more about Da Vinci. Number one, because everybody always calls him this guy who was like a genius and a perfectionist. And in my mind, as I was reading this, I thought to myself, like, really? Like, in the span of living 56 years, you only finished 11 paintings? Like, why? Like, how did that happen? And this would be described pretty often, like you would read through the chapters and be like, yeah, he began this project. He began working on this painting, but never got around to it. Or he would hold on to a bunch of projects, but would never get around to it. To a point where it almost feels like Walter Isaacson would just kind of refuse to admit that he was a bit of a procrastinator. Like, he had a fuck ton of money. He would get these grants approved by the Pope. I think at one point, one of the deals was like, if you paint my niece or my nephew once, I will grant you property. Like, he has this ginormous villa that's in Florence that's beautiful. And I think the deal was he had to make a couple paintings. And so they made the deal before he ever made any of the paintings. So when he lived there, every year they were checking up on him, being like, hey, did you ever get around to finishing those paintings? And he's like, oh, what the paintings? I'm a perfectionist. To be fully honest, I would say a lot of these initial perceptions that I had about Da Vinci were kind of proven wrong. The statements that he was an engineer or that he was a scientist aren't exactly true/accurate as to what Da Vinci did. In my eyes, if I were to write an essay about what I think is the point here, it's that Da Vinci was definitely an intelligent guy. I wouldn't say he was a genius. Granted, I don't really think that word has much meaning anyways, but the way we have kind of turned this guy into the ideal human being doesn't really make any sense, because I think a lot of people would come out of this biography realizing that he was just a human. He was just a guy that was very curious. And so, yes, he was a great painter. There's a bit where they talk about how he was really into math. Like, he never went to school, and so he took a lot of pride in being self-taught and learning alongside other students and asking for mentors to teach him different concepts. And so he was really into architecture. In order to be able to be an architect, you had to have a high level of understanding for math, but he could never really get a grasp of multiplying. And so that served as a big barrier for other very basic fundamental concepts like algebra and how geometry worked, that didn't really ever allow him to be anything other than a hobbyist. And the same case goes for engineering. I think Da Vinci, and I think Isaacson mentions this in the biography, he really wanted to be perceived more as an engineer and as an architect than as a painter. But because of his works, that was the only thing that he was mainly known for. And so when he was approaching the Pope and saying, I will build you military weapons, there were a lot of concepts that get shared around the internet and that get claims that he was a genius. For example, he had the first variation of a helicopter, and that sketch drawing is always gets pointed as see, he was hundreds of years ahead from the Wright brothers. But in reality, that was actually supposed to just be a thing that he wanted in his theater plays. That wasn't ever going to be intended to be used as a plane or be able to levitate. And then I remember one of the designs for the weapons that he was proposing to the Italian military was, and I shit you not, the sketch is a crossbow, but it's a really big crossbow. And to make it up to scale to represent how big this crossbow is, there are like little people loading it up. And that was unironically one of the weapons that he was proposing that they made for the military. And they were like, no, what the fuck? Like, we can't build any of this. Same with any of the architecture design. They're like, we can't really, like, none of this is applicable. Like, these are all cool concepts. And so my theory is that he took a lot of notes. He wrote and shared a lot of his interpersonal thoughts while he was making things. And because he was this great artist and this great painter, his notes look beautiful. They're worth like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so as a concept, if you don't speak Latin, and I think he also like wrote backwards, if you obviously there's so many barriers to understanding what's on it. And so if you just saw the visuals, you'd be like, oh my God, these are like the profound thoughts of a genius. When in reality, he never really called himself that. Like, he just was really into painting, was really curious about the world, would take notes and like would study the flight of birds and would make comments about them and the things that he noticed. And it was kind of somewhat scientific. Like, he would do experiments, but a lot of the conclusions that he came to were just blatantly wrong. And so to say that he was an engineer or that he was a scientist or that he was a genius just isn't really accurate, because at the end of the day, like, none of it was applicable. He was an admirably curious person. And I think I took away from reading this biography feeling way more happy with that conclusion as opposed to how the internet wanted to make it seem. Maybe I'm just talking to myself. Maybe nobody here has ever really heard any of these notions about Da Vinci, but that's always been like a constant thing since I was like in high school. Is like, there are geniuses, there are Einstein, and then there's Da Vinci, and then there are fucking, you know, billionaire CEOs, and all of them are just like on a different plane. And I think when you read these biographies by Walter Isaacson, what happens to me at least is that I kind of just come out realizing that they're very, very flawed and very human. And in that case, I find that to be beautiful. Like, they're not these weird species of people that are different. They're exactly like us, and we just kind of make up cool stories about what they, you know, what they aren't. Because of that, I just kind of I had a lot of feelings about it. I'm happy that I read this. I would say my only problem is that Walter Isaacson is a tendency, because I'm right now currently reading the Einstein biography. I would say that he kind of has a tendency to write a lot of these flaws and bad traits that the subjects have as if it's in a grand light. So for example, Da Vinci only finished 11 paintings throughout like his lifespan, and Isaacson frames it as like, oh, because he's such a perfectionist. And I'm like, man, it's okay to say that he was a little bit like, if you don't do anything, like if you don't work or do anything that's like productive, and you just kind of chill and do research, quote unquote research, like you pull out a notebook and you annotate birds, you can just say that they might be like a little bit lazy. That's okay. It's fine. I think it's if anything, what we should admire about, like, you know, if we want to take certain traits from the people that we read about, he had like an admirable amount of curiosity. Like, he was obsessed with studying people and their facial expressions, and all of these things like benefited the way that he pursued painting, and it helped it actually make it, you know, realistic. This is a concept that artists, especially like VFX artists, try to perfect all the time, is that animators, to be able to make things that feel like they follow the real world of physics, they have to study actual physics. And I think Da Vinci was like an early variation of that, where he was really, you know, paying a lot of close attention to detail about how human nature worked to be able to present it accurately throughout his paintings. And that's very admirable. I think there are really good traits that we should extract from that and try to apply to our lives. Being a genius, though, that's shit. I just don't think that shit matters. Like, I think that's where we start like worrying about stupid stuff that is just silly. But yeah, great book. I would recommend it. So this book I actually bought on stream because somebody in the chat was talking about the short story I Have No Mouth Yet I Must Scream, and I was always telling myself that I needed to just, like, I always wanted to read I Have No Mouth Yet I Must Scream. I realized that Harlan Ellison mostly only ever wrote short stories, and so there was a sale going on for this book, which is basically just a collection of all of his best short stories. And this book is fucking awesome. I have not ever read anything that's related to Harlan Ellison. I've come out of this being such a big fan. It's so saddening to hear that he passed away, I think in around like 2018, but he was just such a character. He is the same case as Kurt Vonnegut, where Kurt Vonnegut really likes to double, triple down on every joke. Harlan Ellison, I think, goes on the opposite side, where anything that has an element of horror or disgust, he will make it 4 times more disgusting to really make sure that you're like painting a picture of what it is that you're like exactly that you're looking at. So eventually I read I Have No Mouth Yet I Must Scream, and I would say that might be one of the greatest short stories that I've ever read. However, it's not my favorite one. There is a short story in this book called Deathbird, and it's one of the most meta-breaking stories I've ever read in my life, where essentially it's like a fantasy retelling of Adam and Eve that in the middle of it becomes a quiz to the person that's reading the book, and in the middle of that quiz it becomes a short story about a dog that passes away, and it's kind of beautiful. Like I almost started tearing up like at the end of it, and then it goes back to the fictional retelling of Adam and Eve, and I'm like, what the fuck did I just read? It's like 36 pages long, and it feels like 400. It's one of the greatest pieces of writing I've ever come across. I'm obsessed with it. There are some other ones that I think were notable. There's obviously I think it's called Harlequin something. I'll put it up on the screen now. Man, like what fascinates me is just great authors have this like really incredible skill of writing satirically, like writing dark themes satirically. You know, as somebody who has like great interest in writing, I really don't know. I cannot even imagine the few people on this earth that are even capable of doing that. There's another short story that I really liked. I forgot what it was called. Oh yeah, it's called Gin No Chaser. And it's literally just a short story of this couple that comes across a lamp hoping that a genie will come out of it, and one does, except it ends up just torturing them and mutilating them in the funniest, most horrific way possible. That might be like my number 3. That might be like my number 3 favorite short story that's on there. Some of the short stories have to do with tiny people, and I couldn't help but notice that Harlan Ellison himself was like 5'4", and there's not much else input I could give other than that's interesting. There's a bunch of things that, you know, people often mention when it comes to Harlan Ellison, that he marched, I think, with MLK at some point. He's a really big activist, and he also mentored Octavia E. Butler, who is another famous author that I didn't, you know, I heard a lot of things about them, but I never really got a chance to like read some of their stuff. And so that leads me to the next book that I read, which was Parable of a Sower. And so the two most popular series that I think come up when it comes to Octavia E. Butler is Parable of a Sower, and then there's Kindred. I have to get around to reading Kindred at some point. I do have the physical copy around, but I mainly wanted to get into this one because I had been told that it had some similar roots to The Last of Us. Having read this, I would agree. For anybody that's watching this that happens to really like The Last of Us, I recommend you read Parable of a Sower, because it's essentially The Last of Us, but without the zombies. Like in this case, it's the end of the world because humanity did it to themselves. It's probably one of the most depressing books I've ever read. Well, I don't even know if I could really say there's a happy ending for any of the characters. I'm just kind of like, this is the book that is trying to give you the idea that it is what it is, man. Life gives you what life has to offer. And finding beauty in that narrative, I think, has made this probably be up there as like one of my favorite books that I've ever read. So yeah, definitely give it a shot. And then I believe that's it. Yeah. Once again, as I mentioned earlier, for at least by my own standards, I know there are people out there that are fucking crazy, can read a book a week. With the time that I have, given the fact that this last year was my last year working as a student and also doing YouTube. And I would just, you know, going into the next year, I would love to just keep reading a bunch of fiction. I'm so happy that I got into this now because number one, I feel like it's really, really helped me improve in my writing. And number two, I feel like I've found so many great, phenomenal authors that I didn't even know existed. Well, Vonnegut and Harlan Ellison in specific were like loosely mentioned once, like years ago in the back of my brain. And other than that, I wouldn't have really ever discovered them if it wasn't for like one video essay I watched when I was maybe 20 years old. And so because of that, I'm just so happy that I made that decision now to just, you know, try to consume as much of it. And I really hope to continue doing so, both because it benefits me and it's also just like a great way I've enjoyed to kill my time. To show some of the things that I finished so far this year, I finished reading The Myth of Sisyphus, which is a book of philosophy. Specifically, it was made by Albert Camus. It's essentially like an argument against suicide. Like in his eyes, it's the definitive argument against the concept of one trying to take their life away. And I thought it was really interesting. I specifically got this because I've been wanting to get a little bit more into reading philosophy. The advice I've always heard is that you can never really read a philosophy book once. And so going into this, I kind of understood that I wouldn't get a full grasp of all the concepts. You normally have to take annotations when it comes to reading these types types of passages. And so I kind of read this knowing that, and I know that I'm probably gonna like eventually end up revisiting it this year. But I think this one was definitely like one of the better reads that I had more recently, especially because there's a segment where Albert Camus talks about the importance of strong feelings in humans, and how, you know, very powerful emotions are enough of a drive to lead people to decide things, and we just don't like acknowledge that often enough. I thought it was really beautiful, but once again, can't say I really understood about like 65% of the things that are in this, but I do intend to revisit that. I also read House of Leaves. I have so many feelings about this book. We would be here forever. So I'm just going to say I read House of Leaves. And I'm currently reading it's over there. I'm too lazy to get it, but I'm reading the Einstein biography that was also made by Walter Isaacson, and another book that's called How to Do Nothing. But yeah, there's still like a shit ton of books that I'm hoping to pick up on this year. Specifically, I would love to read the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I would love to, as I mentioned earlier, read a bit more philosophy. And other than that, if you guys have some recommendations, send them my fucking way, man. I'm your book guy. You guys have some cool shit, send it my way. I will read it. Normally, when it comes to other stuff like games or manga or any of the other type of media that people send me, I'll be like, sure. And then I'll probably never look at it again. But with this, I'll probably read it. Like, if you send me some shit that's like good, there's a good chance I'm going to check it out. So please do so. Other than that, this is going to take a fucking while to edit is what I'm realizing now. So I'm going to say bye now, and I'm going to go edit this.